Welcome to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE and observability 1 week at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend. Welcome back to Slight Reliability. I'm Stephen Townsend, and this is the show where we learn about SRE and observability 1 week at a time. Today, I'm here with Dr. Vlad Ukis to hear about his SRE journey. Hi Vlad, how are you?
Hi Stephen, doing really well and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for the invitation.
Vlad studied computer science in Germany and in the UK. He has worked at Siemens Healthineers after graduating, and he's worked in software and enterprise architecture, innovation management, private and public cloud computing, team and engineering management, portfolio management, partner management, and digital transformation at large scale. He currently works as the head of R&D for the Siemens Healthineers TeamPlay digital health platform. He recently shared his knowledge of DevOps in his book, Establishing SRE Foundations, a step-by-step guide to introducing site reliability engineering in software delivery organizations, which was published last year. So it's an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you.
So when you joined Siemens Healthineers as a graduate, there was no SRE at that time, was there? So what was the situation before SRE came along?
Well, before SRE came along was actually software that just ran on the servers that were immediately used by the physicians in the hospitals. So there was no client server even. There was just, big workstations that the physicians worked at. And when I joined, then the first big move was actually to go client server, because then you actually are able to serve several physicians in the hospital with one server, which is already, of course, a huge improvement compared to each of them having to have its own server.
So was there still a server that was in the hospital or facility?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. So it was a client server, but the server was, of course, on hospital premises and really close to the physicians. Yeah. So then at some point, things started evolving, and we started building the so-called TeamPlay digital health platform, which is an offering that sits on top of Microsoft Azure. So we are a layer, kind of a healthcare layer, if you wish, on top of Microsoft Azure. And there are direct applications that are built on top of platform, or there are also other platforms by other companies that are built on top of our platform. And this is, of course, very distributed computing now, all the modern stack and so on.
So I'm imagining when you move from client server on-premise in hospitals to in Azure and the cloud, that completely changed the way that you think about not only delivering, but also operating the software. Well, what sort of changes happened in the organization?
Well, that was huge, because that was for the first time the company started offering some software as a service. So far, software was never offered as a service. So software was sold as a product. So typically we sell hardware products, and also along with the hardware products, we sell software products. So the whole company was geared towards doing this. So selling hardware boxes and alongside some software that helps the physicians in hospitals to operate that hardware. And then once we started offering software as a service, we started realizing a couple of years in that actually we need to have some serious procedures to operate that software so that we provide the service that we are talking about, right? So software as a service doesn't come for free, or doesn't come just like that because you developed it. It comes because you've got real serious operations processes behind it so that you can actually offer a great service.
Before you heard of SRE, what sort of things was the company doing to try and address that or improve the service?
Yeah, so we had operations engineers that also didn't have experience with software as a service, because nobody did in the company, and they were coming from the so-called customer services department. And they joined our platform, and the customer services department was doing customer service, but not for software as a service. So basically, once we sold hardware and software, then the customer can also buy some service package, and that customer services department then, according to the service package, would service the things that you bought, which includes software. So if something doesn't work, then they took care of this, and they brought that thinking into our organization, and of course, very quickly started understanding that things just don't work the usual way for them. So they started kind of operating the software by setting up some logging, by setting up some alerting on the usual IT parameters, like, CPU goes up or memory goes up, or, there's no CPU anymore, there's no memory anymore, and so on. And very quickly, we all together realized that while this is better than nothing, this is very far away from professionally operating software as a service, especially if you enter the phase of hypergrowth, where there are more and more users, there is more and more data, there is more and more everything, there are more and more stakeholders for this, and therefore also your requirements onto the availability of a single installation of your services are growing also exponentially. And this is where you need something new.
So what was your first exposure to SRE, or site reliability engineering, as a concept?
So at the time, we were literally searching for solutions, because the way we have been operating the platform obviously wasn't working well for us. So we had outages, and everybody had lots of opinions why the outages happened. And then, the next day, another outage happened, and so on. So basically, we kind of saw that we don't have the beast under control. So, there are services running out there, and they're used more and more. But in order to provide a reliable service, you need, first of all, you need the software that is implemented with that kind of reliability in mind. Then you need some real-time monitoring in order to tell you whether you are within bounds of good service, whatever that might be. And then you need the mindset in the teams in order to react timely to those alerts and then fix the things and so on. So you also need to have the mindset in the product management that now a product manager owns everything, including operations of the service. So being the product manager for a service includes also operations. So all these changes we've been going through. And my first exposure to SRE was when I attended the QCon London conference, and they dedicated an entire track to SRE. And I thought, oh, wow, that's interesting, because I'm there to learn about how to operate the platform better. So I spent nearly the entire conference on that track and started learning about this. That was the first exposure. That was before I started reading the famous Google SRE books and so on. So the first exposure was at the conference, and the conference is a great venue for that kind of thing, because you also are able to meet lots of people who are talking about this. And although back then it wasn't a very widespread methodology yet, there was already enough people at the conference to be able to talk about this, to try and understand what it is, to try and understand what the people do, why they claim that they are successful with this, and what it means, and so on. So that was my first exposure with SRE.
Yeah, on the topic of the Google books, it's fantastic that they are there, and there's a wealth of information in them. They're free online as well, which is amazing. But I'm of the opinion that their books are really good at explaining how Google solved their problems. But obviously, no organization is like Google exactly. So how did you have to adjust the ideas in the book to suit your needs? Like, were there kind of big things that you changed, or was it pretty similar?
You are totally right. And that was also, in the end, the motivation for me to write my book on SRE, because the Google SRE books, they are for the advanced practitioners. So when I was reading the Google SRE books, I realized, while this is great, I'm nowhere near what's in the books. So I need so much additional work to be done beforehand, before I can even enter the territory that the books are talking about, that in the end, it made up my entire book, which is also, 600 pages long. So, yeah. So you need to prepare the organization for this. And this is what we did. This is what I then described in my book. And that is a very multifaceted endeavor. So as I already alluded to earlier, so it requires that you establish certain foundational understanding with various stakeholders in the organization that something like SRE might be a good possibility for us to explore to start with, right? So that for that to happen, you actually need to have some people in the organization who are already at least a little bit familiar with the matter, who at least know what SRE is, in which context it's used, why people are claiming that they are successful with this, or what kind of success could you expect once you introduce it, and so on. So you need to have those people as catalysts of change, and they need to talk to very many people in the organization in order to build up enough momentum so that the organization says, okay, fine, we are okay to give it a small try. Right?
That's something interesting. I was just chatting to Amin Astani today, and he was saying that the biggest, like his secret across his whole career, and he's done SRE transformations as well, is it's the social side, it's the selling of these ideas like SRE. Not only the ideas, but then also when you do have success, being able to go, look what we did, look at the success that we had, and then getting people to go, oh wow, we want more of that, and investing into it. So it can't be undersold. I think a lot of people in the SRE space are quite technically minded and maybe aren't thinking about there are people who control the money and the power and decide to make decisions. I need to sell to them in a way.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely necessary. And in my book, I dedicated an entire chapter to this, and I called it the SRE marketing funnel. So it's literally a funnel where at the beginning you do some activities, and then as you move along the funnel, then more and more people get along and more people get engaged with this until you get to the teams and so on.
We've talked about the SRE infrastructure, which is something I hadn't heard of before until I talked to you. What is the SRE infrastructure?
So the SRE infrastructure is something that enables you to do several things. So one is, imagine you are a development team that wants to start practicing SRE, and there is already which is something what I call SRE infrastructure in the organization. So what does it need to enable you to do? So it needs to enable you to say, okay, so these are the service level indicators that are important for my service. So availability is very likely an important indicator for your service. Then could be latency, then could be throughput of something, then could be durability and so on. But availability is very likely important to you, right? So you need to say, from my point of view, so from the point of view of my users, availability and other service level indicators are important. So I specify those. Then for each service level indicator, you should be able to set the objectives. So the SRE infrastructure should enable you to say, okay, so for that service, the objective for availability is this. And then for another service, the objective for latency is that. So the SRE infrastructure then needs to enable you to set those SLIs and SLOs. So then the next thing that the SRE infrastructure needs to enable you to do is to say, okay, so what are the deployment environments where I should monitor the adherence to those SLOs that you just set, right? And you should be flexibly be able to say, okay, so this production environment and this test environment and that and that and that, right? So that's another thing. So then the next thing the SRE infrastructure needs to do for you is to start alerting you in some intelligent manner on unfulfillment of the SLOs. So whenever you break the SLOs enough, then the SRE infrastructure alerts you, and it's got some clever algorithm to do this. So it needs to balance the timeliness of the alert and the seriousness of what happened, right? So you don't want the SRE infrastructure to alert you every time you break the SLO. So that would be on the one hand timely, but that would easily result in the alert fatigue. So you want the SRE infrastructure to actually observe for some time, say, for a couple of minutes or so, what is the error budget consumption, and every time you break the SLO, you consume a little bit of error budget. So once you've started consuming over a window of time enough of the error budget, then it alerts you. right? So that it tries to balance the timeliness with the effectiveness of the alert. And in the original Google SRE books, there are entire chapters on how you do this cleverly. But the basic SRE infrastructure can do just a little bit in order to balance these two constraints. So then you are alerted, and then the next thing the SRE infrastructure needs to do is it needs to aggregate over time, so error budget period by error budget period by error budget period, the fulfillment of the SLOs. And it needs to do this also in aggregate for several services. So that you can say, okay, so here is a team, that team owns 3 services, and that team then over time, for example, never fulfilled its SLOs, right? So we can have a look at the half year's data, it never fulfilled those SLOs. Then that gives you then input into the work prioritization. Right, so you need to look at your SLOs to then see whether they make sense or not, whether they reflect the customer experience well or not. And then if it turns out that the SLOs make sense, but you never fulfill them, then that's a signal into your prioritization to your product manager to actually prioritize some reliability work over feature work because you want your services to be within the SLO. So these are the things that I think the SRE infrastructure needs to provide.
Okay. It makes sense. And on the topic of SLOs, I in the past I've had trouble myself trying to implement them. I think I've got a better idea how I do it in the future now. But one of the things I'm curious about is, in your particular situation, how did you decide what to set your SLOs to? And was it a purely engineering-based decision, or were there maybe people who, from like product owners or business representatives or whatever, from the whole, a more holistic picture involved in the process?
How we introduced SRE in general and how we did everything related to SRE was so-called team-based coaching. That means that we went to a team and we had a session, and then at the end of the session we decided on the next steps and when the next session may make sense, and then the next session took place and so on. And all those sessions, they were team-based. And when I say team-based, then for me, a product owner is part of the team. So therefore, every time we had a session, we had the product owner for sure in the session. Then we had the developers. And then we had the people who are running the service, which in our case are the developers. So basically we had the product management, product development, and product operations on board in each session. And I think that's absolutely a must, because otherwise you don't establish this as something that everybody buys into.
That's great that you had that involvement from the start, and it's not just a thing which engineering teams are doing in isolation.
I think this is really key. This is really key to wide adoption. So then you asked, okay, so how do you go about defining the SLO, especially if the team is new and the infrastructure is new and everything is new? So we did this in a very experimental approach and empirical approach. So what we did, we went to a team and said, okay, so now let's define some SLOs. So before we define the SLOs, let's define the SLIs that are applicable to your service, that you think are important from your customer point of view. And inevitably, everybody says, okay, availability is important. Fine. So then let's start with just availability, and let's add other SLIs only later once we are finished with availability. So then we go like, okay, so we've got the product owner here on board. Then what do you think from your point of view for this particular service are, from the customer point of view, the most important user journey? And then the product owner goes like, okay, the customer has to be able to log on, for example. Then we're like, okay, so great. So that's the most important user journey. So now we've got the developers here. If the customer does this, if the customer logs on, what kind of API call chain does that cause? And the developers go like, okay, that service calls this service, that service calls the other service, and so on. Like, okay, so what is here in this chain really the most important thing, without which nothing works? And then inevitably they will say something like, okay, the authentication provider, that must be up. Otherwise, if the authentication provider is not there, the customer cannot log on. Okay, so this is something that's really at the bottom of the stack. let's assign this some higher availability. Okay, so what's the high availability? Okay, you know from the internet that everybody has got this 99.999 things. So maybe we just start with something like 99.9, just to start with some initial value, because we deem this as high availability. Fine. And sometimes you've got some operations person in there, and that operations person goes like, okay, so actually we've got some SRE infrastructure already here, and I can operate this, and I can actually have a look at the history. So what was actually the availability of that particular authentication provider over the last, say, 3 months? And then, within seconds, he comes up with, okay, actually, it wasn't 99.9, it was just 99. And this is where you're having a discussion. Okay, the team wants to set it to 99.9, but historically we see it's 99, but we just implemented some feature which would bring it up. Okay. And then, through a short discussion, you arrive at, okay, so let's set it to 99.5, and this is already enough to get started, because that's just we call it the initial SLO. So
I would say even having that conversation is a fantastic thing to already happen. The fact that you're talking about, this is a service and it is this important to us, and this is how available we want it to be, is beyond what a lot of teams around the world would be thinking, which is great. Yeah,
that's right. And then the next thing you do is you feed that SLO of, say, 99.5% to the SRE infrastructure, and then it starts generating the SLO breaches, right? So it starts generating the SLO breaches, and then at some point you come together with the team again and say, okay, we don't fulfill this 99.5. And they're like, okay, so why don't we fulfill this? And then the question is, okay, so, but we don't fulfill this, fine, but does anybody complain? And oftentimes, no. Okay, so then actually maybe we don't need to have it at 99.5. Okay, so let's bring it down to 99.0. And then again, you feed that into the SRE infrastructure. And from now onwards, this is an ongoing process.
Okay.
So that's how we went about it.
Okay. I wanted to talk about how your SRE teams were organized. So Google has this sort of centralized SRE team and then a sort of partnership model with the product teams. Meta has a more fully embedded model. How did you do it at Siemens Healthineers?
So we, from the beginning, did it in such a way that in the operations team, we developed and operated the SRE infrastructure. So we've got developers, and they also operate the SRE infrastructure in the operations organization for the entire platform, for all the teams that belong to the platform. And then the individual SREs, they have always been within the development teams. So that's the model that we chose to run with, and that worked well for us.
Okay, so this is what I'm hearing. Correct me if I'm wrong. So you've got two sides to it. You've got an SRE platform team who sort of provides this platform that everyone in the organization can use, and then embedded in each team, you've got these SREs who are part of those teams.
Yes.
Oh,
right.
I like that. Yeah. That's a cool model.
Yeah, and the SREs, they are also never full-time SREs, so they're actually developers with the SRE role. And the developers having SRE role, they are also always on rotation. So each team decides the duration of a rotation, and thereby then they go on call for their services for the duration that they decided that would be good. And in some team, it could be a week. In some team, it could be longer. And also another dimension that you need to add there is the geographies, because we are deployed in several geographies for data protection reasons. So we've got not just one production, but several production environments, so different teams also organize themselves differently there. So in some teams, they say, okay, so if I'm now going on call, I'm going on call for all the production environments, and other teams decide to do this differently and say, okay, so we've got a rotation for EU and US, and then we've got another rotation for other geographies and so on.
So we're coming up in 30 minutes, but there's one more question I wanted to ask you, which is if there was someone out there in the world and they're trying to get SRE going in their organization, but they're struggling, what advice would you give them, or what process could they follow?
Okay. So you mean an organization that is aiming to improve their operations and they are totally new to SRE?
Yes, yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So then I would say you would need to take several steps. And what I would advise to do first is to create an alignment in the organization on what you are going to do and why it's a good idea to try it. So that means you need to engage the leadership of the organization. So you need to engage the head of development, head of product management, head of operations, that this might be a good idea to try. So that means you work the organization in a top-down manner. And additionally, you also need to seed those ideas at the level of teams, at the level of individual developers. So that means you start doing lean coffee sessions and brown bag lunches and things like that about that. So you work the organization additionally also in the bottom-up manner. So once you've done this, you might then reach a point where you've got the approval from the top management of the organization to give it a try. And you've got enough eagerness bottom up in the teams to actually do this. And that's a good intersection that you want to hit. Okay. So then once this is in place, you can then start with the implementation of the SRE infrastructure really in a small manner with one developer. And then you need to find a team that's really eager to try the infrastructure to improve their operations practices. And you need to do this in a really agile manner, by which I mean you always need to have the using team very closely in the loop with the SRE provider, and thereby then the feedback loop between implementing a feature in the infrastructure and that feature being used is very tight. It's really immediate. So basically, as soon as something gets implemented, it gets used. So this is really important to grow the feature base in the infrastructure in such a way that it is useful for that one team. And then from then onwards, you then snowball to the second team, you then onboard them, you implement their requirements, then you snowball to the third team and so on, until you've onboarded literally the entire organization. So then once you've got this in place, which is of course significant effort, you can then see that you might hit a point where you need to institutionalize SRE further, which means you might need to define formal roles of SRE, right? So now we've got an SRE role. So what does that mean? You need to connect it to HR. You need to put it in relation to other roles that might be defined in the organization. You need to start thinking about compensation for out of hours on call and so on. And then once you've got that in place, then you've got SRE firmly in the DNA of the organization. And then you need to ensure that there is continuous improvement on it. So everything that you've got needs continuous improvement, and SRE is no exception, right? So if you've got already some continuous improvement initiative going on that you can attach to, that you can add SRE as a new dimension, then that's a great idea. Otherwise, you just set up some continuous improvement on this and then say, okay, so now the SRE infrastructure can generate also long-term statistics, and we use those long-term statistics in order to drive continuous improvement at a higher level in the organization and so on. I'd say these 4 steps.
Yeah. So sell it first, top down, bottom up. Number 2, implement the infrastructure, but start small. Number 3, institutionalize it. Number 4, drive continuous improvement. It sounds like a recipe for SRE success to me. Yeah.
Yeah, should be generic enough for everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Vlad, for coming on the show and for sharing your knowledge and your experiences implementing SRE in the real world, which is it's just awesome to hear. And I'm going to put a link in the description to your book for anyone who wants to check it out. And thanks once again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Stephen. So I really enjoyed it and looking forward to your comments, to the comments of your viewers.
And for everyone else, thanks once again for tuning into Slight Reliability, and I'll see you all next week.